Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Linode and Health IQ. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. It's been a pretty big week at Mac Stories. I mean, especially for you, because you've been pretty busy. I know you've been working hard the last 2-3 weeks, and we had a couple of things come out on the site that I thought we would let listeners know about first before we dive into today's special topic. And that is we launched some new Mac Stories shortcuts icons, as well as your must-have apps of 2019 story came out last Thursday. So why don't you, I guess, let's start with the icons and explain what's different, because obviously last year in September, we released the original set of shortcuts icons, and those have already been updated. And Sylvia, I know, had worked really hard on putting those together. What came out last week?
All right, so last week we launched a new color set of Mac Stories shortcuts icons. And in addition to that, we also have a bundle that combines both the original icons and the new color set into a single package that's available at 30% off. So the big news is the color set. And the color set is a different version of the icons. And for context, Mac Stories shortcuts icons, which we originally launched in September, they let you customize the look of shortcuts on your home screen. It's a native feature of the Shortcuts app that allows you to choose a custom icon file, and that's what the Mac Stories shortcuts icons do. The new color version is different from the original set. The original set was designed with monochrome glyphs, so monochrome white symbols. And originally they had a transparent background. And the idea for that original set was to make sure that when added to your home screen, your custom shortcut icons would keep the original color of your shortcut. So if in the Shortcuts app, a shortcut was orange and you modified the icon using the Mac Stories icons, the shortcut will still have an orange background. The icon will still have an orange background on the home screen. The color set takes a different approach, and we wanted to do something different from what Apple does by default. So each glyph, each symbol is in multicolor. So Sylvia went through the entire list of 350 different symbols that are included in the set, and each one is being colored. Sylvia came up with a consistent color palette that we use for the two different versions of the icons. You have multicolor icons with a white background because, we wanted to make those look like apps, essentially. And so many modern iOS apps these days, they have a multicolor glyph on top of a white background. And we wanted to accept that reality and sort of allow you to create a shortcut icon that doesn't scream, look at me, I'm a shortcut, but that could be potentially confused for an app. So that was the idea of for people who want to have shortcuts on the home screen without necessarily having to use the default shortcuts look. That was the idea. And there's also another version that has a black background. So a multicolor glyph on top of a black background. And you may ask, why make an icon with a black background? Well, the idea would be that it looks great if you also have a pure black wallpaper on your home screen, because that way the shape of the icon blends in with the rest of the home screen. So it looks like you have a custom shaped icon because you can only see the multicolor glyph. And there's plenty of examples in the announcement post of what I mean by that. I'm using a pure black wallpaper myself, and it's a fun visual effect. So this is the color set. It's, again, 350 multicolor icons in two different versions. Also, if you bought the original set months ago, there's two pieces of good news for you. First, we sent a free update. So this will be the second free update that we sent to the original set for the original set since September. And the second free update gives you monochrome versions of the icons in black and white. So a white symbol with a black background. Once again, the idea would be if you want to have a black and white home screen, now you can do that. And it's a free update for the original set. But also, if you bought the original set, you have a few days left to buy the new color set at a high discount, a very high discount. You can buy the color set at $6, and you should have an email with all the details on how you can do this. If you bought the original icons months ago, up until last week, really, we launched the icons on Wednesday afternoon, and if you bought the original ones on Wednesday morning, you qualify for this discount. So check your email address. If you cannot find the email address, get in touch with us on Twitter or over email, and we'll take care of it for you. And so, yeah, you can buy the color set at a very high discount, $6 instead of $15.
Yeah, it's a really neat set. I mean, I really like the way this, it's a consistent set of 350 glyphs across all of these different styles. And what's nice about that is that if you get all of them, you can really do a lot of interesting things, mixing and matching them to kind of lay out your home screen in a very unique and personal way. And I would encourage everybody who's listening to check out the story introducing these that Federico wrote, because he has a lot of examples in there of how he's doing that. And you've mixed and matched all these, really, haven't you?
Yeah. I use all versions of the icons. I use the original ones. I use the new color ones with the white background, and I also use the new color set with the black background. I have this. I created this sort of effect on my iPad home screen that is like a sidebar of folders, because I wanted to make it look like a desktop with folders on the desktop. You can take a look at the screenshot. It's very fun. And I also wanted to mention that if you're completely new to the icons, if you have no idea what I'm talking about, and you never bought any version of the icons before, I recommend, first of all, check out the icons. You can go to macstories.net/pixel, which is the name of the design brand under which we release these products. And you can check out all the versions, and you can read more details about the products and why you should use them, if and how they're made for you. There's also an FAQ section that you can read through for all the details. But also, I recommend getting the bundle, because the bundle has both sets. You can get it at 30% off. So instead of paying $30, basically you pay $20. That's a $10 discount if you get the bundle. And when you add up all the different versions together, the bundle basically comes, well, not basically, it does come with 1,400 icon options.
Amazing.
So
much work. I mean, Sylvia has really been working on this a long time, I know, and it's it looks great. I mean, I love these icons. I can't wait to incorporate more of the color ones into what my setup, because I spent some time over the holidays doing a lot of this kind of thing like you did, but I didn't have the colored ones yet. So now I've got those, and I'm going to have to try those out as well.
Yeah. And also the second thing I've been working on is my annual list of must-have apps.
Right.
I published that on Thursday on Mac Stories, as I promised. I told App Stories listeners that it was going to be late because I got sidetracked in December, but I was working on it, and it's live now. So 50 iPhone and iPad apps that I consider my must-haves. There's a few surprises in the list this year, but I was really happy with how the story turned out. There's a new home screen section that wasn't there before in previous installments, and it sort of groups together I call them the ultimate favorites. So the apps that, not only do I consider my must-haves because I need to use them, but because I use them all the time and they're on my home screen. Go check it out. It's the annual. I've been doing this story for, I'm pretty sure it's coming into the 8th year at this point.
I would have guessed 5, but boy, you've been doing that a long. I didn't realize you've been doing it that long.
Oh no. I'm pretty sure that it dates back in some version or another to at least 2012.
Wow.
Maybe even 2011. Maybe.
Wow.
But yeah, it's a thing that I do every year, and it's always fun. So go check it out. It's on Mac Stories. You can find it in the featured section of the website at the very top.
Yeah, I always enjoy that story because even despite the fact that you and I work together so closely, there's always at least one or two surprises in there for me too. And I like to try those out myself. And for anyone who's listening who's a Club Mac Stories member, we're going to be doing a special episode of Mac Stories Unplugged just for club members. That's part of the perks you get as a club member of Mac Stories. And that episode will be all about Federico's picks and some of the thoughts and background that goes into all of that.
Now that you mentioned the club, I forgot. If you're a club member, of course, with the icons, obviously there's an exclusive perk for you. You can get the bundle at $5 off. So $15 for the bundle if you're a Club Mac Stories member. And one last thing, if you do end up buying any version, make sure to hit the subscribe button in the purchase page. Not because we want to send you newsletters, but because we want to make sure that you get free updates in the future. So we're always working on updates. We want to give you more stuff after your original purchase. So, but we can only do so if you actually click the subscribe box, because otherwise we cannot just spam you and send you emails. So there's a subscribe box in the purchase page in the checkout flow, and I would suggest clicking that because it means you will get more stuff in the future, and everybody in theory likes free stuff. So.
Yes, people like free stuff, and we don't.
Yes,
we don't spam people. We only send you something when we've got something that we think you'll like. So definitely hit that subscribe button. That's a good tip. So Federico, you know what you and I need to talk about? We need to talk about the iPad, and we talk about the iPad a lot, but a really big date is coming up. A couple of big dates, in fact. We've got as we release this, it is the 10th anniversary of the announcement of the iPad. And the iPad did not come out day and date with its announcement. The announcement was on January 27th, 2010, but the release wasn't until early April. And we're going to be doing some special things at Mac Stories, especially around that April date, because to me, as important as the announcement was, the real important date is when this product got into actual people's hands and they could actually use it and try it. Because it was that date forward when we really started seeing the true story of what the iPad would become over the next decade. But today, because the iPad was announced on January 27th, 2010, we thought we would take a trip back and talk a little bit about that announcement, talk about the presentation that Steve Jobs did in front of the audience. And, in getting ready for this episode, I was looking back at what things were like in January of 2010. And boy, things have changed a lot. It's amazing what happens over the course of a decade. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's things have sure changed a lot. And what's fun is that I remember this event so vividly, like it was 2 months ago. Like I remember all the anticipation and the crazy rumors leading up to the event. I remember how, and I was new to the Apple scene back then because Mac Stories was very young. It was not even a year old, and I remember I was still getting to know all these blogs and all these writers. I was still finding my way in the industry. And so all these rumors, I remember a lot of folks were sure that Apple was going to call it the Apple Canvas.
Yeah.
or the iCanvas.
Or the iTablet. The iTablet was another one.
The iTablet. The iTab was also another, I remember. And Apple actually, Steve Jobs joked about this during the event, saying that the last time there was so much anticipation for a tablet, there were, what was the joke? Commandments written on it.
Yes, and they flashed a big picture of Moses bringing the tablets down. It was pretty funny. It was an interesting presentation, and that's the other thing is watching this presentation. I don't know that over the continuum of 10 years, I don't feel like Apple events have changed that much. But when you step back 10 years and watch Steve Jobs and Scott Forstall and Phil Schiller and everybody talk about the original iPad, it was different back then. I don't ever really see Tim Cook getting on stage and flashing a giant picture of Moses with the 10 Commandments. Do you?
No, I don't. I think we're past that time.
I think so too.
We should be thankful that we got to live in that period. We saw that, and now they're not going to do that anymore.
Yeah, but let's talk a little bit about what it was like in terms of where Apple was with things like the iPhone before this iPad was actually announced. I mean, one of the first things that Steve Jobs did is something that Tim Cook still does, but not quite to the extent that Jobs did, which is he did kind of his little intro rundown of numbers. And so he would, he talked about what was going on at Apple at the time. And one of the things that I don't know, right out of the gate, Jobs talked about the iPod. And I thought, wow, the iPod was still a really big deal in 2010. I mean, they had just sold their 250 millionth iPod in 2010. And that was the first thing out of his mouth. That was the headlining statistic that Apple wanted people to know about. But then he moved, quickly over to iOS, what would become iOS, because it was still iPhone OS at that point, and the App Store. And, we had blow away numbers, as they like to say at Apple. There were 140,000 apps in 2010 on the App Store. Now, I went and looked to see where things stand today, because that number is always moving, and we hear about it once in a while from Apple. But now there are over 2 million apps on the App Store. It's like a huge number more than there were back in 2010. But I think, by 2010 standards, 140 was pretty huge.
Yeah, I remember when it was possible to actually see, the total number of apps on the App Store. You could go to these websites like App Shopper, was still around. I think it's still around, but I'm not sure what the current state is. But there were all these different websites that showed you the actual number of the total apps available on the App Store. And it seemed huge at the time. But then once we got to 1 million a few years later, then it just became a useless exercise trying to count apps or mention. Apple would mention back then in their press releases how many apps were available. And I remember I had created a chart tracking this progress over time. And then, as I mentioned, it just became useless because you got to these huge numbers and then there's no point in keeping track of them.
Yeah, and that was too, that was an era when Apple would also announce how many total apps had been downloaded, because Steve Jobs mentioned that the 3 billionth app had been downloaded. Now, that's 3 billion apps downloaded of a pool of 140,000, which is pretty remarkable. But over the span of, I guess at that point it had been roughly 2 years, 3 billion apps had been downloaded. And very quick, I'm not sure, this might have been the last time we heard that statistic from Apple, because I can only imagine now, 10 years later, what that number would actually be.
It's really remarkable how, I guess, the vision of betting on the App Store, it may be challenging to understand this today, but at the time, there was so much pressure on Apple to make sure that not initially the iPhone, but especially as rumors started circulating about the iPad, and right after the iPad launched, there was so much pressure on the iPad needs to be great at web apps. It needs to be great at web stuff, which is kind of funny because these things tend to happen. Time is a circle from that point of view. Years later, we would have people complaining about Google Docs and Squarespace not working in Safari, and Apple sort of went full circle and enabled desktop mode in Safari for iPadOS. But at the time, what the situation was different, of course. The big contentious point was Flash Player, which Apple did not want to enable on the iPhone, and Apple later said we're not going to enable that in Safari for iPad either. And so this idea of having this vision of being able to say, we are betting on the App Store. We are betting on native apps. We believe the native apps are the better experience. It was a contentious topic at the time. People were complaining, Apple just wants you in their walled garden. They don't care about customer choice. And there were other folks saying, well, not actually, native apps are better than web apps. It was a whole discussion. Like every week there was somebody arguing about native apps versus web apps. Right. And there's not so much of that necessarily anymore these days, but it's important to remember that it was different at the time.
Yeah, and there was a lot of pressure, you're right. I think some of the things we'll get into when we go through the different parts of this presentation kind of reflect that a little bit. But the last two bits of kind of contextual information I want to remind people of is this was, 10 years ago. This was the era of the iPhone 3GS. This is the very first time that an iPhone had 3G. I mean, which now we're talking about 5G, hopefully coming in 2020. It was a big step forward, and that was a very popular phone. But what was really interesting as these tablet rumors were circulating throughout the community was that it was juxtaposed kind of against netbooks, because netbooks were the thing, right? Netbooks were the thing of the day, right? I mean, it was like, when is Apple going to do a netbook? And Steve Jobs answers that during this presentation. But yeah, it wasn't a question of tablets as much as it was, is Apple going to create a laptop that's a really inexpensive one that's far cheaper than, say the MacBook Air or whatever was available at the time. And a lot of people were very disappointed that we never got a netbook out of Apple. But I think time has proven that at least for Apple, the tablet was probably a better way to go. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Linode. Whether you're working on a personal project or managing your enterprise's infrastructure, Linode has the pricing, support, and scale that you need to take your project to the next level. They have 11 data centers spread throughout the world, including their newest center in Sydney, Australia. And with their enterprise-grade hardware, S3-compatible storage option, and their next-generation network, Linode delivers the performance you expect at a surprisingly good price. Get started with Linode today with a $20 credit for listeners of this show. And with it, you can enjoy native SSD storage, a 40 gigabit network, and industry-leading processors, a revamped cloud manager built on an open-source single-pane app, root access to your server along with API version 4 and a Python CLI, and nano plans starting at just $5 per month, and a whole lot more. Just go on over to linode.com/appstories and use the promo code appstories2020 when creating a new Linode account, and get $20 towards your next project. Oh, and you know what? Linode is hiring too. So if you're interested in that, go on over to linode.com/careers to find out more. Again, the URL for that $20 credit, one more time, is linode.com/appstories and the promo code appstories2020. Our thanks to Linode for their support of the show.
The whole presentation of the iPad, so switching to that,
Yep.
I still think it is it's a masterful example of how Steve Jobs was able to deliver a message and make a concise case for why the product was not only a good idea, but necessary. So the whole presentation of the iPad sort of revolves around the idea that over the past few years, before 2010, it was clear that in the tech industry, there was a new opening for a third category of device in the middle of a smartphone and the laptop. And so Steve Jobs, of course, made fun of netbooks, saying that netbooks weren't better at anything because they were cheap. They ran Windows software, which was not great at the time. And then he started making the case for what are the tasks that could be ideal for this kind of device that's in between the smartphone and in between the smartphone and the laptop. And of course, everybody knew that it was going to be a tablet. We knew there was going to be a tablet, but we didn't know the reasoning for why Apple was going to make a tablet.
Right.
And so Steve Jobs laid forth some arguments, some examples of tasks that could be ideal for that kind of device. Browsing the web, doing email, organizing your photos, watching videos, listening to music, playing games, and reading books. Now, most of these tasks, arguably, are media consumption tasks. They are not, as we would call them today, content creation. These examples and the demos that followed were, I am going to say that it's this announcement and the strategy for the following year that shaped much of the iPad narrative for at least 5 years.
Oh, absolutely.
Because until the iPad Pro came out in 2015, so in mid-cycle, so many folks were still saying the iPad is for content, media consumption only. Look at what Apple is doing. Look at how Apple announced the iPad.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, I think that's that's what really, and some of the other things we're going to talk about, really set the stage for the next 5 years. And what was interesting to me too, when Jobs led off with those categories of things that he described a tablet needing to do, he didn't say that it needed to do those exclusively. What he said is they needed to do those things better than both better than both the phone and the laptop, which has always been interesting to me, because I think what he's saying there is that, especially when you look at it through the eye of what was going on in 2010 and the overall context of things like netbooks, is all right. We have our laptops, and those maybe to use one of his other analogies that has probably been misused far too often, so I might as well, which is our laptops were our trucks, and those were for certain types of things, and our phones were our on-the-go devices. Those were the computers in our pockets. The iPad was going to be something that did some of the things that those two devices can do, but it was going to do them better. And that's really kind of the words he used to lead into sitting down in that black leather easy chair and just starting to browse the web. It was really an interesting entree into the actual demos, because this, more than really most Apple events, was a very demo-heavy type of event. Apple really wanted to show what the iPad could do and what it could become through both their own apps as well as third-party apps, because they had a lot of people up on stage showing off third-party stuff too.
Yeah, and it was a really a one-of-a-kind sort of lifestyle presentation of showing like Steve Jobs sitting down, just hanging out and chilling and using the iPad to browse the web, and sort of a very practical presentation of like explaining how you can use the device and what you can do with the device. And you got to believe that the whole narrative surrounding the iPad as a consumption device, as a sort of laying back type of device instead of a PC alternative, it was very much shaped by this presentation and how Steve Jobs saw the iPad. Because maybe he did see the iPad as a primarily media consumption device, not as a MacBook replacement, which is arguably what you could say that the iPad Pro is, at least for some people. But you gotta believe that Steve Jobs did consider the tablet as not a laptop, not a phone, something in the middle, and that middle for him was, largely revolved around consuming media. Yes, you could write email. Yes, you could use Pages, but it wasn't exactly the focus of the device.
Exactly. And right at the center of that for Jobs was Safari. And because he sat down in that chair and the first thing he showed off was browsing the New York Times using Safari. And he described it as holding the internet in your hands. And, in the years since, we've learned that the iPad was actually developed before the iPhone. But then it was shelved because they moved on to the phone, and it eventually came back around and they developed the iPad. So, and it's interesting because I've been going through some of these old rumor articles on Engadget and other places, and there were some of the early rumors were that Apple was working on a Safari tablet. That was what it was described as being the primary function, being accessing the internet. And you can kind of see that coming through in this presentation as Jobs sits down and starts poking his way through various articles. And one of the funny moments though too is that on that homepage for the New York Times, as he was browsing the various articles, there was a little box with a little puzzle piece in the middle of it, and that's where the flash ad was, because famously Apple never supported Flash on any of its mobile platforms.
The demo later moved to other system apps, so Photos, the Calendar, Maps, which was still based on Google Maps data, the iPod and iTunes sort of music app, and YouTube, which again, YouTube used to be a built-in app. There was no YouTube app from the App Store. It was built into the iPhone and iPad back in the days when Google and Apple had a good relationship. Something that stands out to me from these demos is one of the core principles for iPad software design at the time, which is Apple really believed in the idea that the iPad could transform itself into sort of different objects depending on the app that you were using. Something worth keeping in mind is that at the time, iPhone OS 3.2, not even iOS, but iPhone OS 3.2, which is, I believe, an iPad-only version of the software that came out with the device in April, had no support for split view or any other kind of multi-app multitasking. Like, it was a full screen only affair. And obviously the problem was that the hardware was not advanced enough and the software was not advanced enough. But Apple took this limitation, this software and hardware limitation, and ran with it and constructed an entire UI language and philosophy around it. So the idea that the iPad and a single app would take over the screen, which meant that the iPad could become a book when you were reading in iBooks, or it could become a physical calendar when you were managing your calendar, and it would actually look like a calendar with 3D, a 3D animation for flipping through pages. Same in iBooks. Steve Jobs was really happy to show off that animation when you would flip a page in iBooks.
Yep.
It could become, obviously the metaphor would break down with something like Safari, which doesn't have a real world equivalent. But the idea, and same for photos, like for photos, it would be a photo album and you could pinch and zoom and expand your stack of photos. So the idea was the software and the physical world blending together, and what would become eventually a much derided topic, the idea of skeuomorphism and making user interfaces look photorealistic. At the time, it was arguably a necessary tool to teach people how to use a new kind of device, a new kind of multi-touch tablet, because it was a familiar metaphor, it was a familiar concept. And so many of those original apps, of course, are different today. There's still some leftovers from that era. The pinch to zoom and the stacks are still a thing in the OS.
And the paper UI on Notes, that kind of thing.
The paper UI on Notes, the paper texture is still in Notes for some reason. And you can still flip through pages of a book in iBooks, but that's pretty much it. The situation is very different today.
It really is. I mean, the things that really struck me looking back at the presentation in terms of the skeuomorphism was, he had calendar with kind of the remnants of ripped page at the top so that it looked as though the earlier months had been ripped from the calendar. And then you had the stitched leather with contacts. And when you flip those pages in books, as you did it, if you did it really slowly, you could actually see through the page you were turning and see the text from the page that you were turning shining through the actual piece of paper. I mean, there was a lot of detail in there, and it's that era was a lot of fun. I don't know that I would want to go back to it personally. There's been a push towards that, I think, lately, but I think it swung. We were at the stage at that point when the iPad came out of it swinging about as far as it swung, just about. And it wouldn't be too many more years, a couple more years, before we had the pendulum go the complete opposite direction with iOS 7. And I think we're at a place today that's kind of a nicer, happy medium than either one of those eras. But it's still fun to go back and look at all of that.
Scott Forstall was around for this event.
He was very up and energized for this presentation too.
Yeah, it was on fire, honestly. Like, it was talking about I remember this clearly, the second gold rush.
Yes.
For the App Store.
Yes, they had a prospector, a gold prospector up on the slide. I was like, wow, this just is not a slide you would see today. It was, but and I think it reveals a little bit about maybe Apple was a little concerned and nervous about whether developers would buy into this whole iPad thing, because they were clear that, this was going to be the second gold rush. You want to actually make apps designed for this new device. But they hedged their bets too, because they introduced a screen size and resolution that was, exactly 2x an iPhone app so that existing apps, those 140,000 apps that were out there already, could be run on an iPad as well at 2x, which great, they could either be run at 2x or at 1x with a lot of black around the edges. And that wasn't a great experience, but it was a practical solution to a problem, which was, here's a brand new device with absolutely no software for it yet, other than the apps that were designed by Apple.
And for some reason, that is still possible today.
It's amazing. It's amazing to me, honestly.
If you try really hard, you can still install an iPhone app from the iPad App Store and run it in compatibility mode. Honestly, Instagram, maybe it's the reason why this feature is still there. Your banking app, really, it's a bad compatibility layer at this point. It doesn't even support landscape mode. It shows you the iPhone software keyboard. Like it's a bad feature and it should go away. But it's still there for legacy purposes. I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, no, every now and then I'll install a beta or something and not thinking about whether it's an iPad or an iPhone only app, and I'll open it up on my iPad. I'll be like, oh, this is just an iPhone app, and I immediately delete it because I'm just not going to deal with that anymore.
Some notable names from the third-party demos from the event. The New York Times app, kind of weird given they were showing, browsing the New York Times in Safari.
Right.
The Nova game from Gameloft. It was a shooter game. I remember this game very well. They were showing off the graphics and the custom gestures and the mini-map that was on the side of the screen. It wasn't a good game, honestly. Like, it was not a good shooter game, but it proved the point that you could do 3D games with complex touch controls on an iPad.
Yep.
MLB at Bat. This is like... this app has continued to be a keynote favorite for Apple and also an App Store editorial favorite. And to be fair, it kind of is well-deserved because, I know nothing about baseball, but I do know that this app is always at the forefront of adopting new Apple APIs and technologies and screen sizes. And it's been consistently updated for the past 10 years.
It was really impressive what they showed off at that original keynote, too, because this was 10 years ago, and they were showing off video streaming overlaid with statistics about what was going on in the game and all sorts of things. It was a really cool-looking app, and you're right, it has remained a favorite, but it always has stayed kind of on the forefront of what is possible with the iPad.
And before we move on to iBooks and iWork, I want to remind listeners that this event was held in January. The iPad would actually launch in the United States in early April, on April 3rd, 10 years ago. Now, in between the January event and the public launch, developers were asked to actually make native apps for the iPad. The problem is nobody had an actual iPad, a physical iPad to test these apps on. All developers had was a simulator. But the simulator, especially at the time that the iPad was completely new, it wasn't really a good way to get a sense of the physical interactions of holding the device, what it would feel like in your hands, what it would feel like to have a new kind of user interface at your fingertips. And so I remember a lot of folks, including the Omni Group, I remember the Omni Group at a blog post at the time with photos of what they were doing. The developers would print out a cardboard version of the iPad
right.
to get the sense of like the bezels and the screen size. It was quite funny that nobody had an iPad, but so many were trying to build their own to get an idea of what it would feel like to hold one.
Yeah, I remember all these templates popping up online where you could download the template and print something out and create it in cardboard. Yeah, it was amazing. When you think about it, developers didn't have a lot of time. That was like 8 weeks, maybe 8.5 weeks between the announcement and launching. It's pretty amazing that there were as many apps as there were when it launched. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Health IQ. At some point during the last couple of years, you've probably created or maintained a healthy habit, whether that's getting more sleep, working out, or just trying to eat better. And if you've been living a healthy lifestyle, you could be rewarded for your hard work with affordable life insurance rates. saving you up to 41%. Just take the Health IQ quiz, and then they'll walk you through the entire process of applying. The policy is underwritten by one of their top insurance partners, and there'll be a person available on the other end of the phone to talk to you if you want to, too. The savings are exclusive to Health IQ, so you won't find these anywhere else, but you do have to qualify to get the special rate. I've been working out more since the beginning of the year, as I'm sure a lot of other listeners have been trying to do too. And you know what? I took the Health IQ quiz, and it's super simple to do. It doesn't take very long, so I really recommend if you've been working on leading a more healthy lifestyle, just take the quiz and see what you qualify for. It's really a great way to save some money. To see if you qualify, go to healthiq.com/appstories to take the proprietary Health IQ quiz. Depending on your score, as well as other related qualifying factors, you can save up to 41% on your life insurance premiums compared to other providers. Again, that's healthiq.com/appstories to let them know that you heard about them on this show and to start the process with their Health IQ quiz. There's no commitment, and you'll learn even more about the potential opportunities to be rewarded for your commitment to living healthy. One more time, that's healthiq.com/appstories. Our thanks to Health IQ for their support of the show.
So I wanna give you a bit of an exclusive story, John,
Okay.
for this show. It's been 10 years and it feels like I can talk about it.
All right.
So one of the big breaks that I got with Mac Stories in terms of like the site becoming well known in the Apple scene was my first exclusive, and I was doing these stupid articles at the time, which in hindsight, I sort of regret them. But I was able to get an early look at the iPad App Store before it officially opened. Now, I don't remember who it was, but 10 years ago, it was sometime in late March, somebody sent me a link and said, if you open this link in Safari for Mac and you change a bunch of things in like the user agent, there was like a thing that I needed to do, like an additional step. It'll show you the iPad App Store inside a web browser, and you will be able to see all the apps that have been submitted and that have been approved and that are ready for launch when the App Store goes live on April 3rd.
It's amazing to me that was live on the open web somewhere, even though you had to change all those parameters.
Yeah. So I'm looking now, April 1st, 2010, exclusive video back into the iPad App Store, now with more apps. And of course, the video embedded after the break is gone. But I'm pretty sure that if you search for these articles, you will find the articles with screenshots. And I was able to get into the iPad App Store and take screenshots of apps because nobody had any idea what iPad apps were going to look like, what kind of games were going to be available at launch, what kind of productivity apps were going to be available at launch. And so I got in, I took a bunch of screenshots, I took a bunch of videos, and I published this article, and it just blew up. Like, it was incredible. And so many people got to know Mac Stories back then because of that article. And so, yeah, I never told this story before, but
no, you've never told me that in private. Even that's an interesting story. I love it. Wow, Federico, let's switch over to the guy who brought this whole presentation home, which is Phil Schiller, and he this was like a 3-act play. We had Steve Jobs at the beginning, Scott Forstall in the middle, dealing with the third party stuff, and then Phil came in to close it up, I guess, and it was kind of a weird segment to me because he was assigned both iBooks, which you maybe would have thought would have been in the Steve Jobs section, which was the Apple apps, and also to introduce iWork. And the reason I think it's a little odd is because so much of this presentation was focused around consumption, as you said, and this was kind of like and we've got this new app, plus you can do these other things too. And I kind of feel like the iWork thing was an experiment that turned out really well and got thrown into the presentation as a maybe people will like to actually make things on this tablet too. And they weren't really necessarily, Apple maybe wasn't as confident that that was something that would become a thing down the road. But, he led off with iBooks, and iBooks was true to the skeuomorphic design. It was a literal wooden bookshelf. And I remember very vividly, there was the button that you could tap for the store. And then
God.
The bookshelf would swing around, right? It would
like a secret passageway.
And they called it a secret passage during the keynote, which was incredible.
Oh, no, really?
Yeah, they did. And I can't remember whether it was Phil or Steve Jobs, but one of them said that it's like, it's just like a secret passage. And it rotated, and on the back side of the bookshelf was, of course, what was essentially a web page where you can buy your books. And then when you bought the book, it would animate, it would kind of like lift off the page, it would rotate back, and it would drop it on the shelf ready for you to start reading. And it was pretty funny. I mean, it was it was like that for quite a long time. And it was, obviously meant to compete with the Kindle, which was very big by that time. And it was an interesting app. I mean, I like iBooks a lot now, but I kind of like the way it is now. I wasn't a huge fan of the bookshelf, but it was made for a fun presentation back in 2010.
Yeah, it was fun. It was fun for sure. And I kind of miss that. Well, I don't miss that UI, but I miss sometimes I do miss the whimsical aspect of that style of the UI design.
Right.
I don't mean by that I want to have a comeback of 3D heavy animations or photorealistic UIs, but just everyone like the useless and whimsical effects. Sometimes I wish that software was a little more like that these days, but only sometimes, like in super small doses. I am not a iOS 6 whatever nostalgic.
Right.
Little touches here and there. That's what I mean.
All right. Tell me what you think about iWork. What did you think about that part of the presentation?
Pretty much what I continue to believe to this day, that I've always wanted to find a use case for Pages myself, because I think it looks really lovely. It's a really lovely app, but it doesn't really work for me. And every time I look at Pages, I'm like, man, I wish that I had something to write in Pages, because I really want to use it. Being able to drag and drop photos and media elements and create layouts in Pages. But it never works for me. And this is what I thought at the time. This is what I still believe today. And I mean, John, you did try recently to create a book in Pages in 2019 or 2012. In 2020.
I did.
How did it go 10 years later?
It did not go very well. Because the problem I had was, and I looked online, I think that this is actually a bug in the app. It allows you to export to EPUB, and we were doing doing a collection of our favorites from the Club Mac Stories weekly newsletter. And when I would go to generate the EPUB, the icon of the app that is at the beginning of the article that I had centered on the page would be shifted over by, 100 pixels, whatever it is. And no matter
That's fine.
Yeah, no matter what I did, I could not get it properly centered. So you know what I did? I went back to the old standby, iBooks Author, which, oh my gosh, you want to talk about old-looking software now? iBooks Author is painful in a lot of ways. I mean, there are things that are elements and UI conventions and things used in that app that are just not used in 2020, but it got the job done and worked really well. So I was happy to be able to do it that way, because Pages just became completely frustrating almost immediately.
Books Author 2020. This is my campaign for the iPad Pro this year. Give us an updated iPad Pro version of not iBooks, because the name is not in use anymore, but Books Author 2020. That's my platform for my campaign for the iPad Pro software in 2020. I really would love to have that kind of app, honestly.
Yeah, no, it'd be great. And I think it's well suited to it too, because the ability to drag things from window to window. I mean, that's essentially what I was doing in iBooks Author, because I was going through our old newsletters and moving text between the newsletters and iBooks Author. And I would have loved to have done it on the iPad. I tried to do it on the iPad, both on the iPad and on the Mac with Pages, but it just didn't work out. Of these iWorks apps, the ones that I use today, the one that I use regularly today is Numbers. I don't use it a ton, but you and I share a few spreadsheets that we use to run Mac Stories, which I find really handy. I like it a lot more than something like Google Sheets. I mean, I try to keep the Google products to a minimum in my life just because I find them painful to use. But Numbers I really enjoy using, and it's worked pretty well sharing, because it's not like one of those apps where you and I need to be in it simultaneously editing, which is something that like Google Docs is really good at that. But you and I are never in at the same time, but we share it. So if I make some changes, you get an alert, you can go look at it. Same goes if you make changes. I like that a lot. Keynote, I love too, although I just don't have a lot of uses for it. I mean, I've used it in the past for talks I've given, and I even mocked up UIs for iOS apps way back in the day there, because there's so much you can do with the animations. It's really cool. But it was an interesting thing to add on, because these are, fairly complex UIs when you think about it, especially things like spreadsheets and all the styles and other formatting that Pages does. They're fairly complex apps to bring over to iOS at the time, and not everything came over. It was a limited subset of features, and eventually, we got into that situation where the Mac versions lost features in order to kind of get them in lockstep with the iOS versions. But it was still a very impressive feat for 2010. And Apple sold these. If people probably may not remember, these were $10 each. This was still back when Apple was selling its software on iOS, even though $10 was very cheap compared to what it, back in the day it would cost to buy the iLife suite without a Mac. But they were $10 apps, and I think they looked really nice when they were debuted by Phil Schiller.
Yeah, I was impressed, and I knew that I was not going to use them, but I was still impressed. And yes, Numbers, also for me, still the app that I use the most of all. I used Keynote once for the only presentation that I did in my life that I probably ever did in my life, and it was fun.
Well, I do want to touch on one other thing before we close it out, which is one thing that struck me overall watching this presentation was how much the iPad got rotated. In that,
okay,
all right,
that's true.
I feel like even Apple didn't have exactly an idea of how people were going to use this, because I remember Steve Jobs showed how if he held the Mail app in landscape, he'd have his list of messages on the left and a preview of a message on the right. And then if he put it in he rotated it to portrait, he'd just see the one message. And it was, can you imagine reading your email by going through the list in landscape, poking at a message, then turning it sideways to read it, then turning it back to get to the next message? I mean, it was kind of funny. I mean, there was a lot of back and forth, and there was even the weirdest accessory ever. Maybe not ever, but one of the weirder accessories ever was the dock with the keyboard attached.
Well, it is one of the weirdest ever. Yes, I would agree. I had that. I bought that.
Did you really? Oh, I never had that.
Yes. When I was under the delusion that I could write stuff in Pages in portrait mode, I did buy it.
I was going to say, writing in portrait mode is kind of a unique thing. I have tried it on the iPad Mini, but that's not that different than having an iPad Pro with split view. But that's complete digression. But yeah, there was just a lot of rotation of the thing, but even within using a single app. And I think that's settled down both in terms of how people use it and how apps are designed these days.
Something that I thought would be interesting to point out before we wrap up the show is to compare and contrast sort of the things that we see at iPad events now. And in iPad events, I would include not just the last iPad Pro event that we had in 2018. Hopefully, there's another one coming soon. I don't know, but also the iPad event that we had in the spring. So, the original iPad event, of course, there's a lot of explaining around what the device was supposed to do and how you would use it. But I mean, consider the 2018 iPad event. We had, of course, the iPad Pro, and we had demos of apps from Adobe. So we had Adobe Photoshop, which would launch actually a year later, but that's a different story. Procreate, we have the Affinity apps. So a lot of focus on professional software that is now available on the iPad. And as you mentioned, not a lot of rotating devices anymore.
Right.
Apple tends to show off the iPad in the context of what it can do now. And usually that entails multitasking and multi-window and what iPad OS can do for you and all these more powerful features that make the iPad more like a computer. There's a huge focus on accessories. At the last iPad Pro event, we got the second generation Apple Pencil. And so this whole message of like, here's how creative users and artists can take advantage of the Apple Pencil to make something beautiful. The Smart Keyboard and the Smart Keyboard Folio, and usually, again, showing off the iPad, not just because of how portable it is, but how you can use it at a desk in landscape mode with a professional, full-size keyboard. The base model of the iPad, getting integration with the first generation Apple Pencil and the first generation Smart Keyboard. And so the more I think about all these examples of things we see at iPad events now, the more I realize just how much of a turning point the iPad Pro in 2015 was for the entire iPad in its first decade. We have a clean break at year 5 of the iPad's first decade, that when the iPad Pro was introduced, it basically changed the entire iPad lineup forever. With the Apple Pencil, with the Smart Keyboard, and with this more general idea that we can have pro features on the iPad. And looking back now at the first 10 years of iPad, from 2010 to 2020, in 2015, you got that clean break, you got that introduction of the iPad Pro, and you can absolutely see that event as a turning point for the entire device.
Yeah, you really can. And it makes me wonder what we're going to see going on in the future, because we've had 5 years since the iPad Pro was introduced. And I kind of feel like we're still just getting going with it, in the sense that I think it took a very long time to shift mindsets about the iPad, and for people to kind of understand that there's more of a continuum now in terms of what an iPad can do, from the very smallest iPad mini all the way up to the 12.9-inch iPad Pro. And it's a continuum that's a lot closer in scope to something like a MacBook these days than it ever was to the scope and range of the iPhone. So I think we're if anything, the iPad has probably gravitated more towards the Mac side of the space between the iPhone and a Mac than it has the iPhone. And I think that's kind of played out too in terms of some of the things we saw last year at WWDC, whether it's, Catalyst or whatever. There's a tying and a parallel between the Mac and the iPad that just wasn't there in those early days. And I think people are still kind of coming to grips with what that means and what that means for the future. But I think it's exciting too, because it means there's a prospect for a lot more interesting apps in the future. All right, Federico. Well, that is a lot of fun. And you know what? It's a great introduction for what we're planning to do in April. So everybody stay tuned. We got some big plans, but we don't like to talk about these things too early. I would also point everybody to Stephen Hackett's video that he did. He did a really great commentary track for the iPad event on his YouTube channel for 512 Pixels. I'll put a link in the show notes. Everybody should check that out as well. And of course, you can find me and Federico and all the things we talked about here over on MacStories.net. Federico is over on Twitter and Instagram too. He's at Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHN VOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.